You will not marry that woman. Howard Sterling set his crystal glass down at the far end of a dining table longer than most people's living rooms. His voice did not rise. It never needed to. In 34 years of building an empire from nothing, Howard had learned that quiet authority carried farther than shouting ever could. And every person in that room, the housekeeper frozen near the kitchen door, the personal assistant hovering by the hallway, even the portrait of Howard's late wife Eleanor, hanging above the fireplace, felt the weight of those 6 words settle over the room like a change in weather. A single mother. No money, no family name, no connections to anything that matters. That woman will dismantle everything I have spent my life constructing, and I will not allow it. He picked up his glass again and took a slow, deliberate sip. I want you to understand me clearly, Ethan. This is not a discussion. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your eardrums. Ethan Sterling sat at the opposite end of the table, the son's end, the place where he had eaten 10,000 meals under his father's careful watch, where he had received report cards and learned table manners and been groomed, year after patient year, to inherit a kingdom he was never once asked if he wanted. He looked at his father the way a man looks at a mountain he has been trying to climb his whole life, only to reach the summit and find nothing there but wind. Something in his face had changed tonight. There was no defiance in it exactly, no teenage rebellion dressed up in a grown man's suit. There was something quieter and more permanent than that. There was clarity. Then maybe everything you've built isn't worth keeping, Ethan said. He did not say it loudly. He did not need to. Howard Sterling went very still. Ethan reached into the collar of his shirt and unclasped the chain at the back of his neck. The Sterling family signet ring gold, heavy, engraved with the initials HES in a font that had appeared on letterheads and building facades across the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades, slid off the chain and landed on the polished mahogany table with a sound like a small, final period at the end of a very long sentence. Then Ethan stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the dining room without looking back. He left the door open behind him. Howard did not call after him. 1 year later, the man who had walked away from a billion-dollar inheritance received a phone call that would change every remaining day of his life. Howard Sterling had not always been the kind of man who sat at the head of impossibly long tables and spoke in the low, measured voice of a person who has never once needed to raise it to be heard. There had been a time he did not speak of, at board meetings or in the profile pieces that business journals ran about him every few years, a time buried so far beneath the decades of constructed success that most people who knew him now would have been surprised it existed, when he had been a boy eating government surplus peanut butter on stale bread in a Place, 2-room apartment in Tacoma, listening through the thin walls as his parents argued about the electric bill with the dull, exhausted ferocity of people who have had the same argument so many times it no longer even registers as fighting, just as weather. He had been 11 years old. The first winter, the heat was shut off. He had slept in his coat and woken with his breath visible in his own bedroom, and he had gone to school without telling anyone, because even at 11, he understood instinctively that there were things you did not say out loud because saying them made them more real. He had been 13 when his father left for good, walking out with one duffel bag and the excuse that he needed space to think, which turned out to be a permanent kind of thinking that produced no conclusions he ever bothered to share with the family he left behind. He had watched his mother fold herself smaller and smaller over the years that followed, smaller at the grocery store, where she counted coupons in the checkout line with her head low and her movements quick, as though smallness were a form of camouflage that would protect her from the kind of scrutiny poverty always seems to attract. Smaller at parent-teacher conferences, where she apologized for things that were not her fault. Smaller at the kitchen table every evening, until she seemed to disappear into the chair itself. He had made himself a very clear promise in that kitchen. He was 12 years old, and the promise was iron. He would never be small. He would never be counted out. He would build something so large and so solid that no amount of poverty, no cruel reversal of fortune, no faithless departure could ever take it from him or from his family. And he had done exactly that. Sterling Development had begun as a single residential construction project in 1989, a modest 4-unit building in South Seattle that Howard had financed through a combination of a small bank loan, 2 years of saved wages from a construction crew job, and a ferocious refusal to fail. By 2001, it was a regional firm. By 2010, it was the largest privately held real estate development company in the Pacific Northwest, with projects across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, and a headquarters building in downtown Seattle that bore the family name in letters 3 stories tall. Howard had done all of this with Eleanor at his side, Eleanor, who had been the soft constant at the center of his driven life, the person who remembered birthdays and kept the house warm, and sat with him through the 3 miscarriages before Ethan finally arrived, healthy and loud and perfect. In the spring of 1992, Eleanor had understood Howard in the way that very few people are ever truly understood by another person. She had known why he worked the way he did. She had never asked him to be smaller. She had only asked him, in the quiet of the evenings, to remember that there were things in the world that money could not protect. He had nodded at this wisdom and quietly believed she was wrong. Eleanor died of ovarian cancer in 2015. She was 53 years old. Howard had flown in 3 specialists from as far away as Boston and Houston, paid for experimental treatment programs that weren't yet covered by any insurance, done everything that money and determination and the full force of his considerable will could do. It had not been enough. No amount of resources changes the basic arithmetic of a body that has decided to give out. She had been in the hospital for the last 11 weeks of her life, and Howard had sat beside her bed every evening after the day's work was done, holding her hand and talking about things that had no urgency: old vacations, neighbors they had known years ago, and plans for the garden that they both understood would not be planted. Eleanor had held his hand back. That was the kind of woman she was. Even at the end, she was the one offering comfort. After she was gone, the house in Madison Park became very quiet in a way that the square footage made worse rather than better. 6,000 square feet of silence is a different thing than a small room's silence. Howard had responded to it the way he had always responded to everything that threatened to undo him, by working harder, controlling more, filling every available hour with decisions and meetings and acquisitions and calls from time zones 10 hours distant until the grief had no unscheduled space in which to establish itself. It was a method that had served him since he was 12 years old. He was not aware that it was also a method of slow suffocation. He had turned his full attention toward Ethan, toward the project of Ethan, toward the architecture of a future for his son that would justify everything Howard had built and protect everything Eleanor had loved. He would guide this one remaining piece of the life he'd had, steer him toward the right schools and the right career and the right marriage, and no careless accident of sentiment or poor judgment would be permitted to compromise what Howard had spent his entire existence constructing. He had begun, quietly and methodically, to arrange a future for his son, one that included a strategic alignment with the Caldwell family, whose daughter Vanessa had grown up in the same schools and the same charitable circles as Ethan and was, by every metric Howard had ever trusted, an excellent match. He had not yet told Ethan about the arrangement when everything fell apart, because Ethan had already found Ballard. He had been living a double life for nearly 8 months before Howard discovered it. Not a dramatic double life, no scandal, no recklessness. Just a quiet, persistent act of self-preservation. On paper, Ethan Sterling was the vice president of acquisitions at Sterling Development, arriving at the downtown office 5 days a week, in a car that cost more than most people's annual salaries, attending the right dinners and the right charity events, and saying the right things to the right people. But on weekends, and on the increasing number of evenings, when he simply could not make himself go back to the penthouse apartment his father had purchased for him in Belltown, Ethan drove north through the city to a small craftsman house on a quiet street in the Ballard neighborhood that he had bought under a different name through a private real estate transaction his father's people had not yet noticed. He had furnished it himself, badly, with a second-hand couch and a coffee table that wobbled and bookshelves assembled from flat-pack boxes, with instructions he had followed incorrectly twice before getting right on the third attempt. He had bought a houseplant, and it had died within 2 weeks. He had bought another and watered it too much. He was learning, in this small house, how to be a person rather than a position. And the learning was slow and humbling, and the most alive he had felt in years. He met Maya Calloway on a Saturday in early October, when the Pacific Northwest autumn had finally committed to being cold, and the maple trees along his street had gone fully gold. And the air carried that clean, specific smell of wet leaves that Seattle does better than almost anywhere. He was attempting to carry a second-hand bookshelf from his truck to his front door, a project complicated by the fact that the shelf was wider than he'd estimated when he bought it, and kept catching on the porch railing at an angle he could not resolve no matter how he tilted it. He had been struggling with it for 11 minutes, he knew because he'd checked his watch twice, and the second time it felt like an admission of defeat when a voice from the neighboring porch said, clearly, and without particular sympathy, "You've got it sideways." He turned, and there was a woman in nursing scrubs standing on the steps next door, a paper coffee cup in one hand, and the expression of someone watching a man argue with furniture. She was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back and tired eyes that were nonetheless sharp and a little amused. Beside her on the porch, half hidden behind her leg, was a small girl of perhaps 5 years old, who was staring at Ethan with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't staring. "It's a right-angle problem," Maya continued, setting her coffee down and coming down the steps. "If you tilt the left side up about 45 degrees and angle the right corner in first here, I'll show you." And she had taken one end of the bookshelf with a competence that made it immediately clear this was not the first piece of furniture she had moved on her own. And together, following her directions, they had gotten it through the front door in under 2 minutes. The little girl had followed them inside without being invited. Her name was Ava, and she wanted to know why Ethan's house had no pictures on the walls, whether he had a dog, what his favorite dinosaur was, why the plant on his windowsill looked sad, and whether he knew that you could overwater plants, because her mom had told her that sometimes too much of something is just as bad as not enough, and that counted for water, and also for screen time, and also for asking people questions, though Ava had not yet found the personal application of this principle convincing. Ethan crouched down to her level and told her he didn't have a dog, but he had been thinking about it, that his favorite dinosaur was the Ankylosaurus, because it had armor, and he respected that, and that yes, he had in fact overwatered the plant, and he appreciated the information. Ava considered this response with great seriousness, and then announced that he was okay. Maya, standing in his doorway with her arms crossed and a look he could not quite read, had said they would leave him to it. He had thanked her for the help. She had nodded and left. Ava had waved from the sidewalk with both hands. That evening, eating takeout Thai food alone on his wobbly coffee table, Ethan realized he was still smiling. He began to notice things, not dramatically, not in any single moment of revelation, but incrementally, the way a person wakes from a long sleep, detail by detail, sensation by sensation, the world slowly coming back into focus. He noticed that Maya's car left the driveway at 10 minutes past 5 every single morning, before the streetlights had switched off. He noticed that she came home in scrubs that told the story of a full shift, sometimes 12 hours, sometimes longer, and that she went directly inside, and 15 minutes later, the kitchen light came on, and there was the smell of something cooking, and the sound of Ava's voice rising and falling in the particular rhythm of a child narrating her day to someone who was listening. He noticed that on weekends, Maya was outside in the small side yard with tools she clearly knew how to use, fixing a section of fence one Saturday, resealing the front steps another, replacing a outdoor light fixture the weekend after that, with a kind of focused competence that would have been remarkable in anyone, and was especially remarkable in someone doing it alone, between working full-time and raising a child. He noticed that she knew all her neighbors' names, and that they brought her things: a bag of apples from someone's tree, a jar of homemade jam, a borrowed ladder that she returned the same afternoon. He noticed that Ava was always clean and fed and wearing clothes that matched, and that she talked about her mother the way children talk about someone who has never once let them feel like a burden. One afternoon in November, he attempted to fix a cracked board on his own front steps, and made a significant mess of it. Ava was in the yard next door, and provided a running commentary on his technique that was technically inaccurate but deeply confident. He made it worse, then made it worse again. Maya came out to investigate the sounds of increasing frustration, assessed the situation in about 4 seconds, disappeared inside, and returned with a different tool than the one he was using. "You're using a flathead when you need a Phillips," she said, which was not entirely the problem, but was a good start. She knelt beside him on the porch and fixed it in 10 minutes. Ava sat on the top step and supervised both of them with great authority. At some point during those 10 minutes, Ethan had laughed genuinely, freely, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere below strategy and performance, and when he looked up, Maya was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. She looked away first. In the boardrooms and cocktail parties of Ethan's official life, he had met hundreds of accomplished, driven, successful people. He had met executives who had built companies and lawyers who had won landmark cases and entrepreneurs who had disrupted entire industries. He had respected many of them. He had admired some of them. But watching Maya Calloway fix a porch step on a Tuesday afternoon, while keeping one ear on her daughter, and explaining with patient precision exactly why the screw needed to go in at that particular angle, he understood for the first time in his adult life what strength actually looked like when it had nothing to prove. Howard's people found the Ballard house in December. Howard himself placed the call to Ethan's cell phone on a Wednesday morning. And his voice, when Ethan answered, had the particular quality of a man who has assembled his arguments with great care and is choosing to present them at a moment of his own selection. He had run a full background check on Maya Calloway. Single mother, age 31, registered nurse at a community clinic in Crown Hill. No assets of significance. The father of her child was not in the picture, had not been for 3 years. Had signed away parental rights in exchange for freedom from a relationship he'd decided was too inconvenient. Howard presented all of this as though it were a dossier of criminal activity. He then outlined, with methodical clarity, what would happen if Ethan continued down this path. Removal from the company, cessation of all financial support, exclusion from the family trust, and the end of the carefully arranged understanding with the Caldwell family. He was not threatening, he explained. He was simply describing consequences, the way a physicist describes gravity. The conversation in the dining room happened 3 nights later, and then Ethan left. The first months were harder than Ethan had anticipated, and he had anticipated that they would be hard. His accounts were frozen within the week. Howard had moved with the efficiency that had built an empire, clean and unsentimental. Ethan had modest personal savings, enough to cover 2 months of mortgage and utilities on the Ballard house, but the professional world of Pacific Northwest real estate development proved unwilling to employ the estranged son of its most powerful figure. He had interviews for positions at 3 firms. Each one ended early in ways that were politely explained, but clearly traced back to a single phone call from a single office on the 32nd floor of a building with his family's name on it. He applied for a project management position at a mid-sized construction company in Renton. They hired him. The salary was 1/11 of what he had earned at Sterling Development. He took it without negotiating. Maya found out about his real background on a slow, rain-heavy Tuesday in February. She had seen the name Sterling Development in an article about a new mixed-use project in South Lake Union. And she had noticed the family photograph that accompanied the article, a formal shot of Howard and Ethan at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, both in suits, both with the same jaw, both looking at the camera with the same particular quality of contained composure. She had looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she had put her phone face down on the kitchen table and sat with it for the remainder of her lunch break, feeling the floor tilt slowly beneath her feet the way floors do when something you thought was solid reveals itself to be built on different ground than you understood. She knocked on his door that evening with Ava already asleep across the street at Mrs. Hernandez's place, and she stood on his porch in the rain with her arms crossed and her face doing the very complicated work of holding multiple difficult emotions in careful check. She was not shouting. She was something quieter and more serious than shouting. "I need you to tell me who you actually are," she said. He told her everything. The inheritance, the company, the arranged marriage his father had been negotiating, the Ballard house as an escape hatch, the months of watching her life from next door, and slowly understanding that he wanted what she had even if he didn't fully know yet how to be the kind of man who deserved it. He told her about the night at the dining table, and the ring on the mahogany, and the drive north through the city, feeling, for the first time in his life, like a person who had made a decision entirely his own. He told her that he understood if she needed to step back. That he understood why it felt like a lie, even though he had never said anything that wasn't true. He told her that Ava mattered to him, that she mattered to him, and that the life he was living now in this small house with a coffee table that wobbled was the most real thing that had ever happened to him. Maya listened to all of it without interrupting. She was very still through the whole of it, the way still water is still not empty, not absent, but holding everything it contains without spilling. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet, the rain against the window, the refrigerator's low hum, the sounds of a house that had been built into a home by one person working alone. Then she said she needed time, and she went home. She stayed away for 5 weeks. He did not push, and the restraint of not pushing cost him something real every day. He went to work in Renton and came home and made dinner and ate it standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt too much like waiting, which he was trying not to do visibly, even when he was doing it invisibly. On 3 separate nights, he helped Mrs. Hernandez carry her groceries up from the car without being asked, because Maya had introduced him to Mrs. Hernandez, and that was the kind of neighborhood where you did those things, and he was learning what it meant to belong somewhere, rather than merely reside there. He planted another succulent on his windowsill. He did not overwater it this time. He set a reminder on his phone. Water, Thursday. He fixed the wobbly coffee table leg himself, taking 20 minutes longer than Maya would have taken, and using 2 wrong screwdrivers before the correct one, but finishing the job. He stood back and pushed the table with 2 fingers, and it did not wobble. It was, he thought, a very small thing, and it mattered to him completely. Once, during those 5 weeks, he heard Ava's voice through the thin wall between their houses. She was singing something. One of those half-invented songs children make up that follow no particular musical logic, but that carry the complete weight of whatever mood the child is in. And he stood very still in his kitchen for a long moment before he went back to making dinner. He did not know what he would do if this did not resolve itself. He had walked away from $1 billion, and he would do it again without hesitation. But the thought of not being in this neighborhood, on this street, next to this particular house, that was the thought that reached him in a way that the loss of the estate and the title and the accounts had not. Meanwhile, in the stone and glass house in Madison Park, Howard Sterling was doing something he had never in his adult life made a practice of. He was sitting with uncertainty. His house was very quiet without Ethan in it. It had always been quiet since Eleanor died, but this was a different quality of quiet, less like peace and more like consequence. He had begun, without quite meaning to drive through Ballard, not to watch, exactly, not to gather intelligence the way he had the first time, but to look, to see what his son had chosen over everything Howard had built, and to understand why. And to sit with that understanding even when it was uncomfortable. He saw Ethan shoveling a neighbor's walkway on a Thursday morning before work, in a jacket that was not warm enough for the weather, working with the kind of unhurried, purposeful concentration that Howard recognized from watching a much younger version of himself on a construction site in 1989. He saw him teaching Ava to tie her shoes on the front steps one afternoon, a project that appeared to involve significant patience on Ethan's part and significant philosophical objection on Ava's part regarding the necessity of the double loop method versus the single loop method, a debate that had apparently been ongoing for some time, but that ended with the shoes tied and Ava running up and down the sidewalk, testing them with the focused empiricism of a small scientist, confirming a hypothesis. Howard sat in his car and watched his son watch the little girl run, and did not start the engine for a long time. He spoke to people in the neighborhood, not as Howard Sterling, not with his card or his company name or any of the tools he would normally deploy to gather information. Just an older man walking, asking questions in the way of someone who has all the time in the world and is genuinely interested in the answers. He spoke to a woman named Patricia at the community clinic where Maya worked. He had gone in claiming a need for a blood pressure check, which turned out to be necessary and slightly alarming. But that was beside the point. Who said that Maya was the kind of nurse who remembered every patient by name after the first visit, who stayed past the end of her shift without complaint or extra billing, who had once personally arranged transportation home for an elderly man, whose only emergency contact had moved to another state. She's one of those people, Patricia said, who makes the whole place run better just by being in it. He spoke to the teacher at Ava's school during a community open house he had walked into off the street, who said that Ava was one of the most curious and genuinely kind children she had taught in 12 years, and that she came to school every day prepared and settled, and with the particular unshakable confidence that belongs to children who know they are loved in a consistent, unconditional way. He spoke to two of Maya's neighbors, and what they said was not expressible in the language Howard had used his entire professional life. It could not be rendered as a number, or a metric, or a projected return. They said she was the kind of person who noticed, who showed up, who remembered. They said the street was better for having her on it. One of them said, without particular drama, "I'd do anything for that woman." And Howard understood that this was not hyperbole. He drove home through the November dark and sat in his car in the driveway of the Madison Park house for a long time before he made himself go inside. The house was lit the way houses are lit when someone has set timers to create the appearance of occupation, which was not the same as light that came from a person being home. He sat in the kitchen and did not turn on the television. He thought about Eleanor, about what she would say if she could see the past 2 years, and he thought that she would not have to say much. Eleanor had never needed many words to make her meaning clear, but that she would look at him in a particular way. She had that communicated, without accusation and without cruelty, that he had missed something important and that it was not too late to go back for it. He had built Sterling Development on a bedrock conviction that he understood value, that he could look at a piece of land, a proposed project, a set of numbers, and see with precision what something was worth and what it would become. He had been right often enough to build a building with his name on it, 32 floors above the Seattle skyline. But sitting in his silent kitchen, he understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that he had looked at Maya Calloway and measured her entirely by what she lacked. He had looked at what she didn't have, the accounts, the name, the assets, the connections, and had seen only deficit. He had not looked at what she was. He had been valuing the wrong things for a very long time and calling it discernment, calling it protection, calling it a father's love, and in doing so, he had nearly driven his son away forever and called that wisdom too. The reconciliation between Ethan and Maya was not a single moment. It was a return, gradual and honest. It began with a text message from Maya to Ethan on a Monday morning in March, the kind of pale early spring morning when the rain had paused for long enough that you could see the mountains from the end of the street, that said only, "Coffee?" He had stared at those 7 characters, including the question mark, for the length of time it took to understand that the question mark was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It was carrying the weight of 5 weeks and an unanswered declaration and the particular difficulty of being a person who needs to protect herself and her daughter and who has decided, despite all of that, to ask anyway. He replied immediately, yes. She was at his door 20 minutes later with 2 paper cups from the place on Market Street, and she handed him one, and they stood on his front porch in the thin March sun and talked about small things, the new coffee shop that had opened on the corner, Ava's recent enthusiasm for origami, the fact that Gerald the dog had not yet materialized, though Ava had not dropped the subject, and it was both the simplest conversation he'd had in 5 weeks and the most significant. From that unremarkable beginning, something was rebuilt with the slow, deliberate care of people who understand what they almost lost. Maya did not forget the 5 weeks, or what had preceded them. Ethan did not ask her to. What he did instead was the simplest and most demanding thing available to him. He showed up, consistently, without drama, without promises that exceeded his current capacity to keep them. He showed up when Ava's school called on a Wednesday afternoon, and Maya was stuck at the clinic with a patient who had no one else and needed her to stay. He showed up with groceries on a Sunday when Maya came home after a double shift, looking like the world had asked more of her than was fair. And he put them away while she sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for 10 minutes, and he let the silence be what it was without trying to fill it. He showed up on a regular Tuesday evening with no particular occasion or reason, sat at her kitchen table while she made dinner, and talked about nothing important in the comfortable way of people who have decided, without ceremony, that they belong in each other's ordinary days. Ava, for her part, had never really gone anywhere. She had watched the weeks of distance between the two houses with the alert, absorptive attention of a child who picks up on more than adults generally give children credit for, and when the distance closed, she accepted it the way she accepted most things as information to be filed and built upon. She began saving Ethan the bigger half of whatever she was eating. She began requiring that he inspect her shoelace tying every morning, a ritual of quality control that he accepted with great seriousness. She told him, in the spring, that she thought he should get a dog, and that if he got a dog she would name it, and that the name would be Gerald because that was a dignified name for an animal. He said he would think about it. She said that wasn't the same as yes. He said she was correct. Howard came to Ballard on a Sunday in late November, almost exactly 1 year after Ethan had left the dining table. He had not called ahead. He parked on the street and sat in the car for 10 minutes before he made himself get out and walk up the path to the small craftsman house and knock on the door. It was Ethan who opened it, in jeans and a flannel shirt, holding a dish towel, with the sound of something cooking behind him and a child's voice coming from somewhere in the house, demanding to know who was at the door. The two men looked at each other in the doorway. Howard Sterling, who had in his professional life acquired 3 companies in foreign countries, navigated 2 financial crises, and addressed a room of 500 people without notes, could not immediately find the words. His son waited. Ethan had always been good at waiting. "I owe you an apology," Howard said finally. "I owe Maya an apology. And I would like, if you are willing, to begin to make one." Ava appeared at Ethan's elbow and looked up at the old man on the porch with the frank assessment of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to feign approval she doesn't feel. "Are you Ethan's dad?" she said. Howard looked down at her. "I am," he said. She considered this for a long moment. "You can come in," she said. "But you have to take your shoes off because that's the rule." Howard looked at Ethan, who said nothing, but whose expression said everything. Howard bent down and untied his shoes and left them beside the door and went inside. He apologized to Ethan that evening, inadequately at first, and then more fully as the night wore on, and the inadequacy of the first attempt became clear to everyone, including him. He apologized to Maya, who received the apology with a directness and a grace that Howard recognized immediately as the same quality he had watched from his car on those drives through Ballard, the quality of a person who has not survived everything has survived by wasting time on bitterness, but who also will not pretend that things that happened did not happen. She accepted his apology without making it easy, which was exactly the right response, and the one he most respected. Ava gave him a piece of her graham cracker, which was perhaps the more complete form of absolution. The wedding happened the following June, in the community garden 2 blocks from the house on the Ballard Street where everything had begun. It was small, 23 people, folding chairs borrowed from the community center, string lights that Mrs. Hernandez had insisted on providing, and that she and 3 other neighbors had spent a Saturday afternoon stringing between the garden's pergola posts. Maya wore a dress the color of cream that she had found in a small vintage shop on Ballard Avenue, and she had altered it herself the week before the wedding, which Ethan did not find out about until afterward, and which struck him as the most perfectly Maya thing he had ever heard. The cake was a gift from Maya's colleague at the clinic, a nurse named Patricia who had also, without being asked, organized the flowers. The ceremony was performed by a civil officiant who had known Maya's family for years, who cried twice, and who was not the least bit embarrassed about either instance. Ava wore a yellow dress she had chosen herself after considerable deliberation across 3 separate shopping trips, yellow. She had explained to everyone who would listen and was the best color because it was the color of sunshine and also of some of the best parts of scrambled eggs, and those were both good things, and a flower crown she had made with Mrs. Hernandez the afternoon before, sitting at Mrs. Hernandez's kitchen table with ribbon and dried flowers, and a degree of artistic seriousness that had produced something genuinely beautiful. She served as the flower girl with a dedication and a sense of ceremony that silenced the small crowd, walking the length of the garden path with each step precisely placed, and her expression one of absolute professional concentration. Howard Sterling stood beside the officiant, at his son's request, and spoke about love in the stumbling, unpolished way of a man reading from something real rather than something prepared. Which is to say, he spoke better than he ever had in 34 years of boardrooms. He lost his place twice. He found it again. He said that he had spent his life building things, and that the best things were never the ones he had planned. In the year that followed, a number of things happened that Howard would not have predicted, and that Ethan had only half dared to hope for. Ethan's company, a small firm he had quietly built with 3 colleagues from the Renton job, focused on affordable housing development in underserved Seattle neighborhoods, secured a significant contract with the city. The firm had needed capital to scale. Howard had provided it, not as a gift and not as a means of control, but as an investment in something he had come to believe in, presented in writing with terms they had negotiated as equals across a kitchen table in Ballard, while Ava did her homework in the next room, and Maya worked a late shift and came home to find them still talking with the remains of a pot of coffee between them. Maya continued working at the clinic in Crown Hill. She had been offered, twice, positions at larger hospital systems with better salaries and more prestige. She had turned them down twice, because the clinic served people in her neighborhood who needed exactly the kind of care she was providing, and because she had thought about it carefully and decided that the work mattered more than the title. Ethan had not tried to change her mind. He had, instead, helped her draft the grant application that brought the clinic additional funding for a second examination room and 2 part-time staff positions. Ava turned 6 and then 7. She learned to ride a bicycle with training wheels, and then without. She read every book in the neighborhood library's early reader section and began on the middle grade shelves and reported her findings to Ethan with the methodical thoroughness of a small critic who takes her responsibilities seriously. She named the dog Gerald. Gerald was a medium-sized rescue mutt with enormous ears and a fundamentally optimistic disposition, and he slept at the foot of Ava's bed every night and accompanied the family on weekend walks through Ballard, and once, memorably, through the Woodland Park Zoo, where he attracted significantly more attention than the animals. Howard came for dinner on the first Sunday of every month. He brought things a good bottle of wine, a book he thought Ethan would like. Small things for Ava, chosen with a carefulness that was, in its way, a form of apology that continued long after the words had been said. He called Maya by her name rather than introducing her to people, as he had done in the beginning, as Ethan's wife, as though she were an extension of his son. He introduced her as Maya, and he told people what she did for a living with a pride that was genuine and that still, sometimes, surprised him. On a Sunday evening in July of the second summer, the 4 of them, Howard, Ethan, Maya, and Ava, with Gerald arranged across 2 sets of feet, sat on the front porch of the small craftsman house in Ballard and watched the light go golden over the rooftops of the neighborhood. The evening had the specific quality that summer evenings in Seattle sometimes have, when the long Pacific Northwest dusk holds its color past 9 o'clock, and the air carries the smell of other people's gardens, and the sound of the city has softened to something almost gentle. Everything was in no particular hurry. The dishes from dinner were still on the table inside, and no one had moved to clear them. And the not clearing felt like a kind of affluence that had nothing to do with money. Ava had eaten her body weight in watermelon and was now draped across Maya's arm in the boneless way of a child who is fighting sleep and losing on every front. Gerald was performing his evening snoring practice with great dedication and an evident lack of self-consciousness. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing music through an open window, something old, brass and guitar, slow enough for a summer porch, and it floated toward them and fit the evening so perfectly it might have been arranged. Maya had her feet up on the porch railing. Ethan had his arm around her. Howard sat in the chair that Ava had designated as his chair, because Ava had assigned seating on the porch the way she assigned most things with absolute confidence and no explanation, and he held a mug of tea that Maya had made without being asked, because she had noticed somewhere in the past year that he had quietly traded his evening wine for tea, and she had noticed and remembered and acted on the noticing without comment. That was the kind of person she was. That was the kind of attention she paid. Howard had spent his entire career surrounded by people who were paid to anticipate his needs, and none of them had ever managed to make the anticipation feel like care rather than service. Maya made it feel like neither. She made it feel like someone seeing you. Howard looked at his son, who was looking at his wife and his daughter, and his sleeping dog and the golden light on the rooftops of his neighborhood with the expression of a man who has arrived, after a long and circuitous journey, at exactly the right place, and knows it with his whole body. Not the expression of satisfaction, which implies completion. Something more continuous than that. The expression of a man who understands that this is not the destination, but the life itself, the daily, unglamorous, irreplaceable fact of it, and who has the extraordinary good sense to recognize it while he is inside it. Howard had spent his life building things. Structures designed to last beyond him, to carry his name and his work forward into decades he would not see. He had poured himself into concrete and glass and asset columns and strategic alignments, and had believed, with the conviction of the self-made and the traumatized and the genuinely brilliant, that permanence was built from those materials. That legacy was a building. That love was a transaction you structured carefully enough to outlast the parties involved. He understood now, with the kind of clarity that comes late in a life and costs something real, what he had missed. He had spent 50 years building monuments. Monuments to survival, to defiance, to the 12-year-old boy in Tacoma who had made a promise at a cold kitchen table. Monuments were impressive, and they were lonely, and they were made of the fear that you were still, underneath everything, that small, cold boy. And if you stopped building, you would have to admit it. A family was not a monument. A family was a porch, and a sleeping child, and a tired dog, and a woman who made tea without being asked, and a son who had understood, through all the noise of expectation and inheritance and carefully constructed obligation, which life was the real one, and who had chosen it at a cost that Howard had tried to make catastrophic and had failed. He had tried to tell his son who to love, and his son had shown him instead what love looks like, when it is allowed to be itself, when it is not a transaction or an arrangement or a strategic alignment but simply a choosing, day after ordinary day, to be present for another person's life. He had tried to measure worth in the only units he had ever trusted, and he had been wrong in the specific way that very certain people are wrong, completely. The wrongness had cost him a year of his son's life, and nearly cost him everything else. He had spent his career constructing buildings designed to last centuries, but the most enduring thing he had ever been part of building was not a building at all. It was a bridge built not with capital or leverage or any of the instruments of his considerable life, but with a knock on a front door on a Sunday afternoon, and a pair of shoes left beside it, and the long, humbling, essential work of learning, at 70 years old, how to be a father instead of an architect. Money can buy comfort. It can buy the appearance of safety and the illusion of permanence, and the kind of ease that comes from never having to count the days until the next paycheck. It can open certain doors and smooth certain paths and purchase a view from a height that makes the world look orderly and manageable in a way it mostly is not. But it cannot buy belonging. It cannot buy the particular peace of sitting on a porch in the late summer light, with the people who know all of your failures and have chosen to stay anyway. It cannot buy the way a child says your name when she is half asleep, and it means something to her that you are there. It cannot buy the moment when that child decides, on her own authority, without anyone suggesting it, that you are Grandpa Howie, and means it so completely that the name settles into the world and stays. Gerald shifted on Howard's feet. Ava had given up the fight against sleep and gone under, her breathing slow, and even against her mother's arm. The light on the rooftops was going amber, then rose, then the deep and particular blue of a Pacific Northwest summer evening that holds the day long past the hour you'd expect. Ethan looked over at his father, and Howard looked back at his son, and neither of them said anything, because some things are finished being said and have moved on to simply being true. Some things cannot be built. They can only be allowed to grow.